In the last two lectures, I've been talking about arguments for the existence of God. I first introduced the general idea of an argument for the existence of God, and then I introduced three general types of arguments for the conclusion that God exists. And then in the next video, I looked at a particular version of the ontological argument, St. Anselm's famous formulation of the ontological argument, and talked about how best to understand that argument, talked about one possible objection, and how St. Anselm might reply to that. In this lecture, what I'd like to talk about is Aquinas' approach, St. Thomas Aquinas' approach to the existence of God. So I want to do a couple things in this lecture. I want to talk about how to read Aquinas and how to understand the text that you have in front of you, and then I want to talk about the highlights from three different sections of the text, and I want to spend the most time on his famous 5 ways. In the next video, I'll give an overview of the 5 ways here, but in the next video I want to take a closer look at one of those 5 ways, one of those arguments for the existence of God. We'll take a look at the second way. Along the way, we'll also see a couple of arguments against the existence of God that Aquinas considers. And then in the next video, we'll look at how he replies to those objections, those arguments against the existence of God. So here's what you'll need in front of you to get the most out of this video. You'll need the text itself, either printed out or an electronic copy. The text here, right, question 2 on the existence of God. You'll need the whole thing in front of you because I'll be reading from several passages as I go. Also really helpful, I think, would be my notes on this topic. There's a set of notes. What did I call this one? I think I called this one, this set of notes, Is There a God? So on the front was all the stuff about St. Anselm's argument, and the back is all the stuff about Aquinas' approach here. There'll be another handout for the next lecture when I go in more detail on the second of Aquinas' 5 ways, but that's what you need in front of you for this video. You'll need the reading, and you'll need the handout that corresponds to, that's called Is There a God? So first let me take you through how best to read Aquinas, how to understand what it is that he's doing. So the passage or the passages that I've had you read for today are taken from Aquinas' main work, the Summa Theologiae. And within the Summa Theologiae, which covers all sorts of topics and questions, he breaks down the work into what he calls specific questions. But really, they're different topics. You'll notice that here what he's considering is the second question of the Summa, which the topic is the existence of God. Notice that that itself isn't a question. The question is just the specific topic, or I guess the more general topic, and then he'll go into more specific questions. So each question is actually the topic to be discussed. But then within each question, he has several articles. And confusingly, even though the question is the general topic, each article asks a slightly different question on this topic. So, for example, if you look at your reading, the general topic is the existence of God. And under that category, he wants to consider 3 different questions pertaining to the existence of God. 1 is the proposition God exists self-evident. 2, is it demonstrable? Can it be proved? And 3, does God exist? The third question is the one perhaps that we're most interested in, but I want to go over some of the highlights of the first 2 questions. So question 2 is the existence of God, and within that general topic, he has various articles, 3 main questions that he wants to ask about the existence of God. And then within each article, you have to understand how he's breaking down his thoughts here. Within each article, he first phrases the question, and then he considers several what he calls objections. These objections are not in his voice. These objections are objections from people who are going to disagree with him. So he starts off, which can be confusing, with some counter arguments. Here are some arguments from the other side that we need to consider. And he usually lists in the Summa maybe 2, 3, sometimes 4 objections. These are arguments on the other side. So they are opposed to the view that he's ultimately going to defend. So these objections are arguments against his view that he lists them first. Then there's a little section called On the Contrary, in which he lists or cites some authority that agrees with him on the best answer to this question in opposition to the objections. And then after he does the On the Contrary, then he finally gives the I answer that. The I answer that is when he states his own position against the arguments that are included in the objections, and then he gives his own arguments for why he thinks that's the right view. And then after that, what he goes into is he goes and replies to each of the objections one by one. So the general format, once again, then, is he He first outlines the general topic, then he wants to consider various questions underneath that topic, and with respect to each question, he first considers arguments on the other side, then he cites an authority that agrees with him, then he gives his own view and his main arguments for why he holds that view, then he goes back and responds to all of the objections to his view. So noticeably then, the objections are not in his voice. These are not things that he's saying are true. We only get his position in the I answer that and the replies to the objections. So that's how you read Aquinas. Now let's talk about some of the highlights of some of these earlier articles. Remember, each article is a specific question about the existence of God. The first one is the question of whether the existence of God is self-evident. Now, this is sort of a puzzling and sort of technical question, but the highlight of this discussion here is what he considers in objection 2. Once again, the objections are arguments against his view that he wants to consider and ultimately reply to. Let's take a look at objection 2 under Article 1. Here's what he says. This is an argument for the conclusion that the existence of God is indeed self-evident. So we know that Aquinas is ultimately going to argue against that, but what about this argument for thinking that the existence of God is self-evident? Here's what the objection says. Those things are said to be self-evident which are known as soon as the terms are known, which the philosopher, which is how St. Thomas refers to Aristotle, says is true of the first principles of demonstration. Thus, when the nature of a whole and of a part is known, it is at once recognized that every whole is greater than its part. But as soon as the signification of the word God is understood, it is at once seen that God exists. For by this word is signified that thing than which nothing greater can be conceived. But that which exists actually and mentally is greater than that which exists only mentally. Therefore, since as soon as the word God is understood, it exists mentally, it also follows that it exists actually. Therefore, the proposition God exists is self-evident. Now, this is sort of a curious argument, but it should be very familiar to us. Even though he's not listing him by name, this is clearly St. Anselm's argument. And the way that Aquinas is interpreting the argument is in saying that the existence of God is self-evident. Once you understand the terms, then you'll see that God has to exist just by definition. And so this is the way he's interpreting St. Anselm. Notice that this is an objection here. Aquinas ultimately wants to object to this. He doesn't think this argument works. So in order to find his response to that argument, we'd have to look to his reply to objection 2. So here's what he says in the reply to objection 2. Contra, or against St. Anselm, here's what he says. Perhaps not everyone who hears this word God understands it to signify something than which nothing greater can be thought, seeing that some have believed God to be a body. Yet, granted that everyone understands that by this word God is signified something than which nothing greater can be thought, nevertheless it does not therefore follow that he understands that what the word signifies exists actually, but only that it exists mentally. Nor can it be argued that it actually exists, unless it be admitted that there actually exists something than which nothing greater can be thought. And this precisely is not admitted by those who hold that God does not exist. So this is Aquinas' objection to, or reply to, St. Anselm's argument for the existence of God. We saw at least one objection already from Gonolo, and I'm asking you to puzzle about, maybe you can come up with some other objections. But here's what St. Thomas's objection is. He doesn't buy St. Anselm's argument. And he seems to give maybe 2 replies. The first one is right in the first sentence. He says, perhaps not everyone who hears this word God understands it to signify something than which nothing greater can be thought, seeing that some have believed God to be a body. So his first reply, or his first possible objection, or his first quibble with St. Anselm's argument, is he seems to be calling into question premise 1. Now remember what premise 1, go back and look at the sheet if you don't have it in front of you, for St. Anselm's argument. The first premise said that by definition God is that than which nothing greater can be conceived. The first objection that Aquinas is raising is maybe some people don't buy that definition. Maybe that's not how everyone is going to be thinking of God. And, well, he's got a point. If you don't like that definition of God, then yeah, the argument isn't going to do anything for you. I think this is kind of a weak objection, though. I think that anyone who does believe in God, sort of in the Judeo-Christian tradition, is going to think that God is the most perfect being possible. So even though St. Thomas is pointing out that some people might not accept that definition, we might say they should, or they do if they just think about it for a little while. So that's his first reply, though. But what about the rest of it? What is the rest of his reply? He says, "Yet granted that everyone understands by this word God has signified something than which nothing greater can be thought. Nevertheless, it does not therefore follow that he understands that what the word signifies exists actually, but only that it exists mentally. Nor can it be argued that it actually exists, unless it be admitted that it actually exists, that there actually exists something than which nothing greater can be thought." And this is precisely is not admitted by those who hold that God does not exist. What exactly is his complaint here? I go back and forth on this, on how to interpret Aquinas' objection to St. Anselm here. Sometimes I think that what he's stating is just a similar sort of worry as what Gonolo is raising. What he's suggesting is, well, look, you can't just prove the existence of something just by thinking about it. Maybe something like the Lost Island objection maybe shows that. And so there must be something wrong with the structure of the argument, or something wrong with one of the premises. Though maybe here too, Aquinas isn't telling us exactly which premise is false. So maybe he's complaining in the same way that Gonolo is. But other times, if you look at what he says in the I answer that, I won't read it all, but if you take a look at what Aquinas says in the answer that for this article, it looks like what he might be challenging, what he might be calling into question, is actually premise 2 of St. Anselm's argument. The premise here is something like we can think of, or we can conceive of, that than which nothing greater can be conceived. One of the things that Aquinas seems to be calling into question in the I answer that, and maybe also in this reply to objection 2, is that he's less sure that we actually can have such a concept, that we can fully conceptualize what God is, that we can have God in our minds. St. Anselm is much more pessimistic about our ability to properly conceptualize God, given that we are finite, limited creatures with limited minds. He's worried that even the concept might even be sort of beyond our abilities. And so at some points he seems to call into question premise 2. So then here we go. We got a few more possible objections to St. Anselm's argument from Aquinas. Sometimes in the beginning of this objection, reply to the objection, he seems to be calling into question premise 1, calling into question or doubting whether everyone would accept the definition of God that St. Anselm uses. And he also seems to call into question premise 2. He seems less sure that we can actually conceive of the most perfect being possible. We can conceive of what God is. So that's the highlight of Article 1, is St. Thomas adds a few possible objections to St. Anselm's argument. I'm less sure that they are really decisive objections, but you can let me know what you think. Now I want to talk about the highlight of Article 2. The question is whether it can be demonstrated that God exists. Now here we're not going to get yet to arguments for and against the existence of God. That's not until Article 3. So what's he talking about here? Well, let's take a look at the first objection, the argument that he considers on the other side. Here's what objection 1 says. It says, "It seems that the existence of God cannot be demonstrated, for it is an article of faith that God exists. But what is of faith cannot be demonstrated, because a demonstration produces scientific knowledge, whereas faith is of the unseen. Therefore, it cannot be demonstrated that God exists." Notice what this objection is saying. What it's saying is that the very project of trying to come up with arguments based on reason for thinking that God exists is the wrong sort of thing to be doing about the existence of God. This is what we might call the faith objection to the very project of arguing for and against the existence of God. Look, the existence of God is not the sort of thing that you can prove. It's not the sort of thing that you should try to prove. Believing in God is a matter of faith. It's a jump. It's a leap. It's when you don't have enough evidence or don't have any argument, then you come to believe. That's what faith is. This is the objection, and there might be one that several of you were thinking about as we're going through the general project of arguing for the existence of God. But notice that this comes up in the objections. Aquinas wants to argue against this approach. He thinks that this objection is misguided. He thinks that it is proper and appropriate to argue for the existence of God. And so to see what his problem is with the faith objection, take a look at his reply to objection 1. Here's what he says on the next page. "The existence of God and other like truths about God, which can be known by natural reason, are not articles of faith, but are preambles to the articles. For faith presupposes natural knowledge, even as grace presupposes nature, and perfection supposes something that can be perfected. Nevertheless, there is nothing to prevent a man who cannot grasp a proof, accepting, as a matter of faith, something which in itself is capable of being scientifically known and demonstrated." So what's his problem with the faith objection? What Aquinas says here which is sort of a bold claim, is that strictly speaking, that something like God exists is not a matter of faith, but is a matter of argumentation, is a matter of reason. He says that this is not the sort of thing that you have to rely on faith. You can show by reason, he thinks, that God exists. And people can come to see that it is true just based on their own natural abilities. They don't have to have any kind of religious experience. They don't have to make a leap of faith in order to see that God exists. That's what Aquinas is saying. But important is the last sentence, right? What he wants to say is that even though the existence of God can be demonstrated by reason, there's nothing wrong with believing in God by means of faith. Right? Why not? Well, because he says that maybe the arguments for the existence of God are really technical and hard to understand. And so if that were the only way to properly believe in God, then only really smart people who have studied for a long time are legitimately allowed to believe in God. He says, well, clearly we can't have that. So faith is allowed for those either who don't have the time to work through the arguments or aren't able to get through them because of their difficulty. He says that faith is an acceptable avenue, right? He's St. Thomas Aquinas, right? He doesn't have a problem with faith. He's just saying that the existence of God is something that you can get to in both ways. You can get to it by means of faith, but you can also get to it by means of reason. Now, Aquinas doesn't think that every piece of belief that Christians have can be demonstrated by reason, but he does think that a whole lot of it can be demonstrated. He thinks things such as like the Trinity and Christ's real presence in the Eucharist are matters of faith. Reason can't show them one way or another. But he thinks that you can show by reason, as we'll see, that God exists, that God is one, that God has various attributes, that God created the world, etc. So Aquinas thinks that reason has a big role to play here. It can do quite a bit towards leading you toward the truth, he thinks. So those are the highlights then of Articles 1 and 2 of Question 2 here on the existence of God. From Article 1, we highlighted St. Thomas's reply to or objections to St. Anselm's argument. He gave at least 2 objections. And here in Article 2, we considered something called the faith objection to the very project of arguing for the existence of God, and we saw how Aquinas responded to that. Now I want to jump to Article 3 and focus on where the real issues are with respect to this reading. I think those other things that we mentioned from Articles 1 and 2 are important, but we get right to the meat, right? We get right to the important stuff in Article 3. So the question is whether God exists. Now he's finally going to go into arguments for and against the existence of God. Now we have here 2 objections, and then we have an on the contrary, and then we are going to get his answer, and then we're going to get his reply to the objections, just like in any other article. But notice that objections to whether God exists will turn out to be arguments against the existence of God. And so here Aquinas is going to consider 2 leading arguments against the existence of God. Now Aquinas always considers the very best objections that he can think of. And not only the best that he can think of, but they're also often very, very good objections to his view. He doesn't want to build up straw men and take those down. He wants to bring up the most important arguments against his view. And so this is what we see him do here. The 2 objections that he considers here are not only 2 of the strongest arguments against the existence of God in his day, they continue to be the 2 most strongest arguments against the existence of God today. They are the ones I think that if you were to ask people who don't believe in God why they believe in God, I think these would probably be the 2 most cited reasons that people would give. So then what I want to start with is I want to start with his description of these 2 arguments against the existence of God. I promised you we were going to consider not only arguments for the existence of God, but against the existence of God. So here are 2 big ones. So objection 1, it seems that God does not exist, because if one of 2 contraries be infinite, the other would be altogether destroyed. But the word God means that he is infinite goodness. If therefore God existed, there would be no evil discoverable. But there is evil in the world, therefore God does not exist. Though he doesn't refer to it by this name, this is perhaps the biggest argument against the existence of God, perhaps the most cited reason why people don't believe. This has come to be known as the problem of evil, or the problem of suffering. Now, to understand what the problem is, we first have to understand what is meant by evil here. Evil is just means sort of bad stuff. And there are 2 kinds of bad stuff in the world. There is what we might call the moral evil, which is what we ordinarily think of when we hear the term evil. These are the bad things that we do to each other. These are the bad things that are results of voluntary decisions by conscious agents. But there's also various natural evils. Now, you might say, is it right to call those evils? Well, all we mean by evil is bad stuff. So there's natural bad stuff. There is bad stuff that happens in the world that no conscious agent is responsible for. So things like natural disasters, or cancer, or other diseases, right? Coronavirus. There's an instance of bad stuff in the world. So you start with the problem of evil by focusing on what we mean by evil. We mean by just bad stuff. And there's two kinds of bad stuff. There's the moral evil, the stuff we do to each other, and then there's the natural evil, the stuff that happens to us, not as a result of any conscious decision by any of us. So how does the problem of evil go? Taking that conception of there is bad stuff in the world, how does that get you an argument against the existence of God? Well, the argument runs roughly as this, that if there were a God that was all-knowing and all-powerful and all-loving, then there would be no evil of any kind in the world. Since if he were all-knowing, then God would know how to prevent it, and then he would know that it is occurring. Because he's all-powerful, he'd be able to stop it. He'd be able to do something about it, if anyone could. If he couldn't do something to stop it, then he wouldn't be omnipotent. He wouldn't be all-powerful. And also because he's perfectly loving and perfectly good, he is sufficiently motivated to prevent that evil, to prevent that suffering. So the general idea of the problem of evil is that if you say that their God exists, and by God you mean something that is all-knowing, all-powerful, and all-loving, then it looks like it should follow from that there is no evil in the world. Sort of put less formally or more technically, the general idea is when really bad things happen, we start to wonder, how could a perfectly good God let this happen? If you're not quite seeing the force of the argument, that means things have been going pretty well in your life. And you should be thankful for that. All you need to do are focus on specific examples of sort of horrendous suffering that individuals go through. Think of, for example, a case like the Holocaust. Many Jewish people who survived the Holocaust did not survive with their faith intact. After the horrors that they had seen, they could no longer believe that there is a perfectly powerful, all-loving God in charge, because if there were such a thing, there's no way that he would have let this happen. Or think about the sad sort of cases in which, young people dying of cancer or other terrible illnesses, who are clearly innocent and have done nothing wrong. How could a perfectly good God allow this to happen to those innocent children? So the strength of the problem of evil, then, is to focus on particular cases of horrendous suffering that seem completely uncalled for. When innocent people suffer and die, that's the problem of evil. Because the question is, how could a perfectly good God let that happen? The fact that the evil is here and that there's just so much of it is evidence for thinking that there couldn't possibly be a perfectly good, all-powerful, all-knowing God. If there is a God, then it couldn't be all-powerful. And if it isn't all-powerful and all-loving, then it's not the sort of God that we should care about. That's the problem of evil. And Aquinas here is mentioning this here. One of the strongest arguments against the existence of God. He's going to have something to say about this. To reply to the problem of evil has been one of the perennial questions or tasks in the history of philosophy. So he's not going to be able to settle it once and for all here. But we'll see later on his reply to this objection. He's going to give us something like, here's a strategy for how you might try to reply to the problem of evil. So the idea, once again, the problem of evil is that evil can serve as evidence, maybe even compelling evidence, that God does not exist, because if a perfectly good, all-powerful, and all-knowing God did exist, then we shouldn't see any evil, or at least we shouldn't see nearly as much, or the kind of evils that we see. What about the second objection? Here's another argument against the existence of God, objection 2. Further, it is superfluous to suppose that what can be accounted for by a few principles has been produced by many. But it seems that everything we see in the world can be accounted for by other principles, supposing God did not exist. For all natural things can be reduced to one principle, which is nature, and all voluntary things can be reduced to one principle, which is human reason or will. Therefore, there is no need to suppose God's existence. So what's the argument here? Once again, Aquinas doesn't refer to it by this name, but this is essentially the argument from science. The argument says that God is an unnecessary hypothesis, is that as science is able to explain more and more of the natural world, there's less and less of a reason to think that there's any God behind it. Previous things that people used to try to explain by means of gods now have perfectly sound scientific explanations. And so the idea is that once science is complete, once it can explain all the features of the natural world, all the features of a human being, what is there left for God to explain? The general assumption is that it's inappropriate to bring in other things, more complicated or different sorts of things to explain phenomenon when you have a perfectly good explanation already, right? So if I come down with a cold and try to go to the doctor, and the doctor says, oh, yep, I see what's going on here. The reason why you have a cold, right, is because that there is this virus that latched on and is doing this and this and this to your body. And if I were to say to the doctor, well, that's your explanation, but my preferred explanation, right, is that there are these bad fairies that sometimes get into you, and the bad fairies, right, get into fights and arguments with your good fairies in you, and this war, this turmoil is what causes sickness. I mean, the doctor will probably laugh at you and probably think that you have gone mad or are not being serious. Why? Because what you've done, why we think that this is an inappropriate explanation, is because, look, we got a perfectly good explanation from medicine. It would be inappropriate and indeed silly to bring in something like fairies to explain this phenomenon. Similarly, the argument from science says that, well, all the natural phenomena can be accounted for by science alone, and so it would be inappropriate, it would be silly, it'd be like bringing in God to explain something is like bringing in fairies to explain the common cold. It just doesn't make any sense. It's just an inappropriate thing to bring in. So once again, I think this is one of the strongest arguments against the existence of God. It's just unnecessary. I don't believe in God because I don't think it's necessary to bring him in to explain anything. And you ought not bring in anything that you don't need in order to offer an explanation for the phenomena you see in front of you. That's the argument from science. And indeed, these put together, I think, are two of the strongest arguments against the existence of God, and two of the most cited reasons that I think people even today give for why they don't believe in God. Either because they have a strongly scientific worldview according to which God doesn't come in as an explanation, isn't needed, or because they focus on the existence of horrendous suffering in the world, and they just don't see how that could be compatible with an all-powerful, all-knowing, all-loving God. As I said, Aquinas always considers the strongest arguments against his view, and here are two of the strongest arguments against the existence of God. But Aquinas wants to argue on the other side. He wants to argue that God does exist and that reason can show this. So he has to give his own arguments for this conclusion, but he also has to reply to those arguments against the existence of God. So let's move on to what he's going to say next. So the next section of the article is the on the contrary. Now here's a funny thing. Here, usually in the on the contrary, he cites an authority that agrees with him against the objections that he's just considered. So who is the authority that he cites in this one? He said, the on the contrary says, it is said in the person of God, I am who am. So Aquinas is being a little bit funny here. Who's the authority that he cites in favor of God existing? God. People say you don't exist. What do you say about that? But I do. So Aquinas is being a little bit funny here. But the real bulk of the article here is his I answer that. And when we get in the I answer that, we get his famous 5 ways, or 5 different arguments for the existence of God. So what I want to do is I want to read through each of them. I want to describe what's going on in each of these arguments, just generally. Each of the arguments is going to start from a different observation or premise, and each one of them is going to reach a slightly different conclusion. They're all going to try to argue for the existence of God, but they're going to focus on different aspects or different attributes of God. So let's take a look at the first way. The first and more manifest way is the argument from motion. It is certain and evident to our senses that in the world some things are in motion. Now whatever is in motion is put in motion by another, for nothing can be in motion except it is in potentiality to that towards which it is in motion. whereas a thing moves inasmuch as it is in act. For motion is nothing else than the reduction of something from potentiality to actuality. But nothing can be reduced from potentiality to actuality except by something in a state of actuality. Thus, that which is actually hot, as fire, makes wood, which is potentially hot, to be actually hot, and thereby moves and changes it. Now, it is not possible that the same thing should be at once in actuality and potentiality in the same respect, but only in different respects. For what is actually hot cannot simultaneously be potentially hot, but it is simultaneously potentially cold. It is therefore impossible that in the same respect and in the same way a thing should be both mover and moved, that is, that it should move itself. Therefore, whatever is in motion must be put in motion by another. If that by which it is put in motion be itself put in motion, then this also must needs be put in motion by another, and that by another again. But this cannot go on to infinity, because then there would be no first mover, and consequently no other mover, seeing that subsequent movers move only inasmuch as they are put in motion by the first mover, as the staff moves only because it is put in motion by the hand. Therefore it is necessary to arrive at a first mover, put in motion by no other, and this everyone understands to be God. So this first way, as I said, each of his 5 ways starts with a different observation or premise and reaches a slightly different conclusion. So what's going on with the first way? This is the one we might call the argument from motion. That's the key term or key idea that he's working with. So the idea starts with the observation that in the world some things are in motion. Now we have to understand what he means by motion here. It's not just moving from place to place. It's only one kind of motion. That's locomotion. Motion more generally just means changing in any way. So the first observation is just that some things change in various ways, sometimes in place, sometimes in other, change in color, or change in other thing. Change in temperature is one of the ones that he seems to be using here. So the argument from motion then starts with the observation, or the argument from change, starts with the observation that some things change. And then through a series of premises, he ultimately tries to prove the existence of a first mover, something which moves everything else, or changes everything else, but which itself is not changed. That's the first way. Now let's take a look at the second way. Now there's a lot of interesting details to be explored in how he gets from his first observation to the conclusion, but I want to give just a general overview of each of the 5 ways. Next episode, I'll go into the second way in a bit more detail so we can get a better sense of how he's moving from premise to conclusion. But here's the second way. The second way is from the nature of the efficient cause. In the world of sense, we find there is an order of efficient causes. There is no case known, neither is it indeed possible, in which a thing is found to be the efficient cause of itself. For so it would be prior to itself, which is impossible. Now in efficient causes, it is not possible to go on to infinity, because in all efficient causes, following in order, the first is the cause of the intermediate cause, and the intermediate is the cause of the ultimate cause, whether the intermediate cause be several or only one. Now to take away the cause is to take away the effect. Therefore, if there be no first cause among efficient causes, there will be no ultimate, nor any intermediate cause. But if in efficient causes it is possible to go on to infinity, there will be no first efficient cause, neither will there be an ultimate effect, nor any intermediate efficient causes, all of which is plainly false. Therefore it is necessary to admit a first efficient cause, to which everyone gives the name of God. So what about the second way? What's going on here? This is the way we might call the argument from efficient causation. Now, what is efficient causation? Here's a rough sketch, the general idea of what an efficient cause is. So the last argument, the way from motion, is about change, is about something being caused to be a different way than it currently is. The efficient causality is less about something causing something to be in a different way. Efficient causality is about something causing something else to exist in the first place. So this is the argument from causing to exist, essentially. The argument from efficient causation. And this starts with the observation that some things are caused to exist. And then through a series of premises, he wants to ultimately reach the conclusion that there must be a first efficient cause. There must be something which causes everything else to exist, but which itself is not caused to exist. That's the second way. Now let's move on to the third way. The third way is taken from possibility and necessity and runs thus. We find in nature things that are possible to be and not to be, since they are found to be generated and to corrupt, and consequently they are possible to be and not to be. But it is impossible for these always to exist, for that which is possible not to be at some time is not. Therefore, if everything is possible not to be, then at one time there could have been nothing in existence. Now, if this were true, even now there would be nothing in existence, because that which does not exist only begins to exist by something already existing. Therefore, if at one time nothing was in existence, it would have been impossible for anything to have begun to exist, and thus even now nothing would be in existence, which is absurd. Therefore, not all things are merely possible, but there must exist something the existence of which is necessary. But every necessary thing either has its necessity caused by another or not. Now, it is impossible to go on to infinity in necessary things which have their necessity caused by another, as has been already proved in regard to efficient causes. Therefore, we cannot but postulate the existence of some being having of itself its own necessity, and not receiving it from another, but rather causing in others their necessity. This all men speak of as God. So the third way is the argument from possibility and necessity, or we might call it the argument from contingency. What we mean by some things being contingent is that it could fail to exist, or that it could have not existed in the first place. A necessary being, on the other hand, is something that had to exist, that couldn't have not existed. So the argument begins with the observation that a lot of what we see seems to be contingent, as evidenced by the fact that it does pass away, or at least that we can imagine the universe without this particular thing. So it starts with the observation that various things are contingent, could have easily not existed. And then through a series of premises, he wants to reach the conclusion that there must be something that is entirely necessary, that must exist. Not everything can be merely contingent, such that it could fall out of existence. There must be something that has to exist and that has stable existence and can't be taken out of existence and had to exist in the first place. That's the third way. Now let's take a look at the fourth way. The fourth way is taken from the gradation to be found in things. Among beings there are some more and some less good, true, noble, and alike. But more and less are predicated of different things, according as they resemble in their different ways something which is the maximum, as a thing is said to be hotter according as it more nearly resembles that which is hottest, so that there is something which is truest, something best, something noblest, and consequently something which is uttermost being. For those things that are greatest in truth are greatest in being, as it is written in Metaphysics Book 2. It's a reference to Aristotle. Now, the maximum in any genus is the cause of all in that genus, as fire, which is the maximum heat, is the cause of all hot things. Therefore, there must also be something which is to all beings the cause of their being, goodness, and every other perfection, and this we call God. The fourth way is what we might call the argument from grades of perfection. And it starts with the observation that for various good qualities, there seems to be a sort of gradation or a spectrum. There seems to be an idea that some things are beautiful to different degrees. Some things are not that pretty. Some things are okay to look at. Some things are pretty. Some things are beautiful. You might even say even some things are sublime. So we have this scale of beauty. Anything's also general goodness is like this. Maybe there are other features that are like this, that are scalar like this. And so he starts with that observation, and through a series of premises, he wants to conclude that there must be something that has all of these attributes to the maximum degree. So there must be something that is the most beautiful thing and the source of all beauty. There must be something that is the truest good, the most ultimate good, and is the source of all goodness in all other things. And so it wants to try to prove the existence of something like a maximally perfect being, something that is perfect in all of the good respects and causes the good respects in all of the other things. Now the last way, the fifth way, is the last one I want to talk about in this video. The fifth way is taken from the governance of the world. We see that things which lack intelligence, such as natural bodies, act for an end, and this is evident from their acting always, or nearly always, in the same way, so as to obtain the best result. Hence it is plain that not fortuitously, but designedly do they achieve their end. Now whatever lacks intelligence cannot move towards an end, unless it be directed by some being endowed with knowledge and intelligence, as the arrow is shot to its mark by the archer. Therefore some intelligent being exists by whom all natural things are directed to their end, and this being we call God. Now, what's going on with this argument? This one we might call the argument from the governance of the world. That's what he calls it. Or it's a kind of argument from design. It starts with the idea, the observation, that things consistently grow to particular ends or consistently act in particular kinds of ways, right? Dogs bark and cats meow. The acorn grows into an oak tree and not a maple tree. So what he's pointing out here is that things seem to act in certain ways and direct themselves toward particular ends. And he thinks that this is not an accident. He thinks that this calls out for some designer who has designed things so as to act or develop in those ways. So the argument from design then starts from the observation that things act consistently towards particular ends. And he, through a series of premises, wants to argue that this shows that there must be some intelligent designer that has designed things to act in those consistent ways or toward particular ends. So that's the fifth way. And now we have Aquinas' 5 favorite arguments for the existence of God. Does he give us all the details of this argument? No. It's supposed to be just a summary. He spends a lot more time talking about some of the details of these arguments in other sections of his works. But he's giving us the gist. We've got 5 arguments here. We've got the argument from motion or change. We've got the argument from efficient causation or causing to exist. We've got the argument from contingency or possibility and necessity. We've got the argument from grades of perfection, and we've got the argument from the governance of the world, or the argument from design. Now, what kinds of arguments are these? I want to make a couple of general comments to conclude this video on these 5 ways. So it looks like the first 3 ways are versions of cosmological arguments. The first 2 are clearly about causal relations, and I said any argument that's based on causes and things is going to be a cosmological argument. I also said that another species of cosmological argument was one that focuses on the contingency of things in the universe or the universe itself. And so the third way is also a cosmological argument. The 5th way is clearly a teleological argument because it's sort of a design argument. But what about the 4th argument? The 4th argument is kind of a curious argument. But the way that I want to understand this is that the 4th way is a kind of Platonic argument. It seems to look a lot like the way in which Plato argued for the forms and indeed for the form of the good. What Aquinas seems to be doing here is that using a similar structure of argument that we saw in Plato to argue for the existence of God. And so what we see a bunch of medieval Christians do is that they'll identify the form of the good that Plato talked about with God himself. God is the form of the good that Plato was talking about. So the 4th way is a kind of Platonic argument. So then we got the general categories of each one of these arguments. Are any of the arguments any good? Are they effective? Well, we might have some serious doubts about the 5th way because Aquinas is writing before Darwin and before he knows anything about evolution by natural selection. We might wonder whether his argument, the 5th way, holds up. Because it looks like we do have a pretty good explanation for why things act consistently toward particular ends. Because the ones that didn't make it, didn't survive, didn't live on to create offspring. And so there's some interesting questions about whether the 5th way still holds up in light of what we know about contemporary evolutionary biology. I don't know. There's a discussion ongoing about whether there's anything to his argument, even in light of that. But what about the other ones? I want to focus in the next video on the 2nd way and go into the details about how he's trying to reach his conclusion. But here's one general concern that one might have about all of these arguments in general, is that the last line of each of the arguments is always something like, and this all men or all human beings call God. But look, in the 1st way, all he's shown that there has to be a first changer. And in the 2nd way, all he's shown that there has to be a first efficient cause. And in the 3rd, he's just arguing that there has to be a necessary being. Does that really get us anything like God? Not obviously. And so it's a possible complaint about his arguments is that he's way too quick to identify the thing that he's argued for with the Judeo-Christian God. That's a nice objection. I like that objection. I think Aquinas can respond in 2 ways. The first way that he can respond to that objection, that he's much too quick to identify what he's proven the existence of with the Judeo-Christian God, is that he could say, you're right, that's too quick. I have to say more about why we should identify that with the Judeo-Christian God. He could just admit it. Yeah, you're right. That's just the start. I've just given you the start. Now I want to go on to explain why I think this has to be actually God. So he could say that. The other thing he could say is, imagine if all of the 5 ways worked. Imagine they were sound. Imagine we accept all the conclusions of all 5. What would that give us? it would give us something like a first changer, something which is responsible in the alteration of all things, something which causes all things to exist, something which is completely necessary, something which is maximally perfect in all ways, and something which is an intelligence that designed the world for a particular purpose. When you put all of those conclusions together, that seems to get us something like the Judeo-Christian God. And so in reply to the objection that, well, that doesn't get us God, Aquinas could say two things. One, he could admit it and say, yeah, I got more work to do. Second, he could say that, well, if they all work, you put all these attributes together, then you do get something very close to the Judeo-Christian God. And so that's a summary of Aquinas' 5 ways, his 5 favorite arguments for the existence of God. We also talked about his 2 arguments against the existence of God. And so we have a couple things left to do in the last video. I want to explore how he's reaching his conclusion in more detail in the second way. I want to talk a little bit more about the details, resolve a few possible confusions about the second way. And then I want to also talk about how he replies to these 2 arguments against the existence of God. That would be really interesting to know because they continue to be the strongest and most forceful arguments against the existence of God. So we should see what he says about them so that maybe we can have a good idea of whether these replies work and whether we can use them to help ourselves or to explain to other people. That's what we'll look at next time.